Hello and welcome to Recap Radio. I'm Diego Cupolo, editor-in-chief of Turkey Recap, and this is our live show about Turkish politics and foreign policy. Today I'm talking to Lisel Hintz, assistant professor of international relations at Johns Hopkins University SAIS, and author of the book Identity Politics Inside Out, National Identity, Contestation, and Foreign Policy in Turkey. She also has another book under contract with Cambridge University Press, expected next year, titled Fight Scenes, Pop Culture as Political Battleground in Autocratizing Turkey and Beyond. Hi, Lisa. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Diego. Thank you. And sorry I chose such long titles for books. I've got to be more concise next time.
I'm doing my best, but it's great stuff that you do. And I should mention that Lisa is one of our first supporters at Turkey Recap, and she's often a very helpful participant in all things Turkey. So if you appreciate Turkey Recap, you owe Lisa a thanks because she's been, cheerleading our cause since the start. So I have to thank you as well.
Well, it's been a pleasure to cheerlead. I think it's such an incredible project. I think your team does such good work. I think it fills a niche that needed to be filled. So keep on keeping on. I'll keep cheerleading as long as you all are keep doing.
Yeah, much appreciated. And we are going to keep on keeping on. So to get to what we're going to talk about today, Turkey's changing. A lot of that change is based on making new narratives and maintaining power structures. Media frames narratives, and so do cooking shows. And Liesel has studied both while also working on a book about AKP's grand strategy for the so-called New Turkey. So we're going to cover a lot of ground today, including the PKK peace process and the ongoing crackdown on the CHP, Turkey's main opposition party. And we're also going to do it by looking at these developments through the lens of pro-government media, which aims to create the cultural narratives that support Erdogan's broader political projects. Before we start, let me restate this is a live recording with a live audience. People listening to this are welcome to send questions, and we aim to talk about 45 minutes to an hour. Now, Lisa, to start, you're in Istanbul right now. I'm in Ankara. We're both very hot. It's very hot in Turkey these days. Apart from the heat, what have you noticed during your most recent visit? Because you tend to come regularly to Turkey over the years. Is anything changing? Anything that you're noticing?
Yeah, I do. I try to come to Turkey every summer for at least 2 months. I feel like if I'm going to be writing, speaking this much on it, I need to kind of stamp Turkey authority card and kind of listen to what people are talking about and what media that they're watching and kind of figure out what the buzz on the ground is. So yeah, I'm here in Istanbul on the 6th floor of what is kind of like a greenhouse. So I apologize if I'm a little shiny, but interestingly, this so far has not been the hottest summer yet. I think last summer was pretty brutal, but I would say over the last 4 summers, there's definitely an increase just in like everyday tension. In terms of like shoving on the metro or people, yelling at drivers or just everyday little confrontations, I find people seem to be quite tense. And I think a lot of that has to do with the politics. I think a lot of that has to do with the economy. Kind of measure the economy by the price of a simit. And last summer, I was astonished that it was 12 lira. It's now 20 lira on the street. The idea that you could like hand over a 200 lira note to a simitçi and not have them yell at you is beyond me. So that I think is something, just noticing the prices in the stores. And then there's obviously the self-censorship, right? There's those who are going to continue to speak out and have the courage to do so. See, as you mentioned the crackdown on the CHP. Those crackdowns are extending to the culture industry, as we'll talk about. They've obviously extended to academia, lots of other sectors as well. But I think that there is a greater sense of hesitancy for a lot of people. And I think that's the goal of these kinds of crackdowns, is not only to silence particular individuals, but to send a message that this is what can happen to you and to make examples of them. So I definitely see a little more tension, a lot higher prices, and people, I think, really concerned about the government crackdown.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely more tension, that's for sure. So to talk to start off on some of your research, and there's a lot, you cover everything, so you actually hit all the good points here. We're going to start with your new article. It's titled Cooking Shows as Gender Edutainment in Authoritarian Regimes, a Recipe for New Turkey. Uh, in this, you write television content can impart values, behavioral norms, and other identity components to audiences in ways similar to nation building institutions such as education systems, but in more efficient and engaging manners. Uh, can, can you talk about this and also what your research is highlighting? Because basically, you're looking at cooking shows and showing how they model gender roles and convey examples of othering. Uh, what has your research found on the utility of mass media here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that I try to do as a political scientist who has passed as a pastry chef, who trained in theater, who has kind of all this cultural background, is really get us to understand politics through the lens of culture. So I'm overlapping quite a bit with media cultural studies, anthropology, sociology. But in political science, we're asking these very big questions about how do parties remain in power and what strategies do they use to do so, and how can we create support or legitimacy or fear or intimidation in ways that we can remain in power, kind of what we call regime durability strategies. And I think that we need to take a look at, particularly within political science, I think we need to take a look at the role that media plays quite a lot more. And not just in terms of kind of quantitative studies about numbers of viewers or things like that, but rather what are the content of the strategies and how are governments using them to try to create the idea of citizen. And so in my first book on identity politics and foreign policy, I talk about kind of three institutions that the government, the AKP, when it came into power, kind of tried to first weaken and then remold in order to be able to project its vision of the ideal Turkish national identity, what I called at the time Ottoman Islam. And in that book, I looked at universities, I looked at military, and I looked at the judiciary. Now I'm looking at the media, which is kind of the next logical step. And it's also the case that when I was doing the research for that book and how you sort of use these institutions as nation building or sociocultural engineering, I saw how much people were talking about politics through pop culture or kind of through cultural materials and references to them. And so I thought, well, why not pay more attention to not only how I, as a researcher, can understand politics better by looking at these three cultural lenses, but also how governments and opposition actors are using music and film and television as political tools, political platforms. So why not cooking shows, right? So I have this background as a pastry chef. I learned Turkish through watching hundreds and hundreds of hours of cooking shows. And what you see, and this by no means specific to Turkey, is that there's very much a didactic kind of teaching, modeling role that these hosts engage in. And what I was finding, having started in 2013 up to Turkey and doing fieldwork, to 2023, when I started the project on cooking shows, what people were saying had changed so much. Over the course of that 10 years, you had many more headscarved women who were appearing on cooking shows. You had a lot more Islamic advisors or experts who would kind of come in and talk about how to celebrate Ramadan properly, the history, the importance of Islam in Turkish culture. You had lots more, inshallah, mashallah, bismillah, like lots more of those references. And while those are sometimes just casual phrases that even a non pious person uses, like inshallah, right? Some of them have more of a kind of a deeper religious connotation. And some of the guests were saying, well, you need to say a bismillah before you prepare your food. And so that became something that was kind of a lesson. So all of that, I thought, why not kind of look at the vernacular of identity construction? Because when we see the effectiveness of audiovisual entertaining media, when we study it, you can see that, and there's a whole like industry of edutainment, right? How do you get kids to learn math? You do it through cartoons and exciting ways, right? That keep them engaged. that promote memory retention, and again, can kind of keep that attention span and make it enjoyable. So I kind of looked at cooking shows as doing the thing. They're sort of in a the shiny ponytail and a fancy dress, and they're kind of talking about how you have to have at least 3 children and you have to celebrate Ramadan in a particular way, and like all of these narratives that are so closely mirroring what the AKP is saying are being delivered kind of innocuously in this entertaining platform without people realizing. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, yeah. And reading your article, I actually thought about The Real World on MTV and these kinds of also what's that thing with the Simon guy? America Has
Oh,
Talent.
X
The
Factor, American Got Talent. Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah,
I'm
I do find as teenagers watching that, when I was a teenager, Real World was on TV. I do feel like they're not organized as live shows and contests, but they do model what's appropriate behavior for the teenagers that are forming their identities. So when I watched Simon and whatever these contests are that are popular everywhere, often they show the judges' reactions. So I feel like if I was a teenager and I was watching somebody do something interesting on stage and then seeing the reactions, I'm being taught how to react to this thing,
yeah,
right? And that's what I'm seeing also in the cooking show is like what's acceptable, what's the right behavior, what do we do in Turkey, right? And
exactly. Yeah, in terms of kind of admonishing particular behaviors, encouraging others. So I look at host shows like a Nursel Argin type figure, kind of the girl next door who imparts tips and life hacks. But then I also look at these competition shows where there's a winner at the end of every week. For some of them, others like MasterChef, it goes on for like 9 months. I don't know how that's possible. I guess with that kind of budget, you can't. And it's great exposure for these people as well. But what's really important about reality TV is 2 things. One, it is heavily curated, right? They are
Mhm,
trying to particular stories, they're trying to create drama, they're trying to, make sure that there's something that's controversial, that, some kind of argument, right? So The Real World was a fantastic example of that. And as one of the first reality TV shows in the United States. And, you would have producers stoking conflict kind of encouraging contestants, or in that case participants, to maybe bring up something about this. Well, might you not accuse him of using the race card, right? And so they're deliberately kind of trying to create drama because that's what keeps people entertained. And so
mhm,
in the shows that I'm watching in Turkey, very much of like praise for the women who like sew their own clothes and all make everything from scratch and have lots of children and are demure. They also tend to win prizes when voted on by their peers. And then you have, the kind of tattooed, scruffy voice fighter kind of a woman who maybe speaks too loudly. People, denigrate her both within the competition itself and then on YouTube comments. So that's where that kind of othering or stigmatizing role can come in. And you're exactly right what you said about kind of the judges' expressions, because there's framing of ways like painting or curating a villain, or making sure that someone comes across as the good individual. There's lots of narrative tricks that these shows do in order to
mhm,
make that. So it really does kind of seem like you're embodying lessons about how to behave.
mhm. Yeah, and a lot of that can be done through editing and
Yep,
selective
exactly.
choices, right? And
Yeah, called post
you
production. They do a lot of post production.
yeah. Yeah, yeah, and you're focusing a lot on media and authoritarianism and how they work together. You have another article that recently came out titled "Filmmaking the Nation Great Again: Audio Visual Audio Visualizing History in the Authoritarian Toolkit." Sorry, I'm not used to reading these long words. But in that article, you write that populist autocrats frequently aim to galvanize support by calling for a return to an idealized past or golden age. There's often this kind of like past, right, that we're trying to get back to. I think people that watch the US see Trump as that, like we should go back, make America great again. This obviously in Turkey is conveyed by a lot of the historical series that show historical people, real or not. One of them is Resurrection Ertuğrul, which might be the most famous example. And these are produced by government-friendly companies, and they seem to be reaching global audiences with a lot of success, most famously Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. But I'm wondering who you think the target audience is for these historical shows from Turkey, which are popular, and what impact do you think they have inside and outside Turkey?
So, a couple things to unpack there. The first is that a lot of my research is on media in authoritarian contexts in particular, which means that you have a political economy such that, yes, you have TRT, which is kind of the state television station, but even on private channels that are owned by holding companies that have banking, construction interests, and mining interests, they show pro government content in exchange for the tender to build the next bridge or looking the other way when their mine collapses and things like that, right? So you have this kind of crony capital that shapes the content on television. So that's really important. So when I was kind of talking about the ability to curate an ideal citizen or the vision of that citizen, it's easier to do in authoritarian regimes, but it doesn't mean it's not happening in democratic regimes as well. And I think if you look at the way that Donald Trump has been targeting the media, right, and opening up lawsuits against media organizations that have printed things that are critical of him, if you look at the ways in which editorial columns have changed, softened, right? Like the media is really, really important, but it's not an institution that is immune to political power and coercion and capital. And I think that's all really important. So within these TV series, the government, the AKP, has very much expressed its desire to achieve not only political hegemony, but hegemony. And they're resentful that they haven't. And they want to be able to control the images of how Muslims are portrayed on television, for example. And that's something that our tool has been extremely successful in, not only in Turkey, but outside as well. So you mentioned these external audiences. And even outside of Turkey, of the Ottoman world, if you think about numbers in Pakistan, for example, there are cafes that are opened named after Dirilish. Like it's very much a soft power tool that has been quite well received by a lot of Muslims because a lot of the material coming out of other places, in particular Hollywood, is showing Muslims as the bad guy. And here you have them as the victors, you have them as moral, you have them as family men, you have them as finally someone that I can be proud of, right? And so in the US, we're starting to see shows like Rami and Mo, where you can empathize with Palestinian and Muslim characters and you can see them as good individuals, but that hasn't traditionally been the case. So it makes a lot of sense that they want to control how Muslims are portrayed. And let's not forget that Turkey, it's now, I think, kind of tussling between positions 2 and 3, is one of the world's largest exporter of television. So this has very much been a lucrative strategy and also, I think, an influence campaign. And one last thing that I'll note about that in terms of sort of why Dirilish Ertuğrul, why direction. In 2012, you had The Magnificent Century, was their super popular television show about the Ottoman era, about Suleiman the Magnificent. And Erdogan, in public speeches, took issue with it because he said, we've never seen a leader like that. He was on horseback for 30 years. He wasn't gallivanting around with women in the harem and drinking alcohol, like just, raging against this particular. And then you saw fines, you saw it being removed from Turkish Airlines. And then you actually see the creators themselves changing the narrative. So you have one of the characters who was known for being perhaps the most seductive, covers her hair in praise and supplication. So the fact that these television shows are reacting to government pressure, I think, is really interesting. Government's care is really interesting. And I see The Magnificent Century, which is the controversy arises around December 2012. You have the Gezi Park protests very soon after that, in which actors and individuals in the culture industry played a tremendous role in terms of giving concerts. Duman was one of the bands there. In terms of Halit Ergenç and others kind of being visible and showing up. And that, I think, provoked this need to kind of initiate a war on the culture industry and be like, nope, we're not going to allow that narrative to be spread. We need to dominate it. And I think that's how you see the establishment of Resurrection, which comes out, I believe, in 2014 on their television station. You then have iteration after iteration after iteration of these Ottoman, proto-Ottoman shows. Payitaht Abdul Hamid is another one, which Erdogan has explicitly is mirroring politics. So it's a big strategy.
Yeah, yeah. And then as you talk, I wonder what the counter argument is, because in the West, a lot of traditional media is not keeping, let's say, like they're not keeping the same narrative, especially on vaccines. And you can have the counter argument for having uncontrolled narratives about important issues. But when it comes to history and politics, it does serve a purpose. And while reading your work, I can't help but think of Erdogan's speech about the peace process. He's been referencing the past over and over while talking about why Turks and Kurds need to be together again. And Saturday, he gave his big, big speech where his wife also cried at the end. So I think it was a big moment for him as a leader. I think he's trying to be a regional figure with this move. Yeah. And to just cite some of the content of his speech on Saturday, he referenced golden eras, like you mentioned, of the past, where Turks, Kurds, and Arabs work together. And when those three groups work together, he says we achieved the Malazgirt victory, the conquest of Jerusalem, the conquest of Istanbul, Çanakkale, Independence War. So he keeps citing these golden eras where things worked out, and he's using that to argue that we're going to start a new golden era by working together with this, by ending the Turkey PKK war. So, there's so many historical narratives. Both Erdogan and Öcalan have repeated them in their messaging, which I find super interesting that it's so coordinated, the messaging. So what do you make about the peace process messaging? Because it's just such a current topic that
It really is.
relates to your work.
Yeah, and like evolving day by day, and obviously very controversial in terms of should the Kurds be engaging in negotiations or in talks with a government that is so blatantly cracking down on the CHP? Should the CHP not have spoken up more vociferously when the government was cracking down on the Kurds and removing their mayors and so forth? So I think it is super topical and incredibly important. But what you noted, I think, is indicative of so many populist strategies. If we kind of think about what are some of the common characteristics of populist narrative, strategy, ideology, you can parse which one you kind of adhere to there. There's an us versus them dynamic. There's a pure people and a corrupt elite dynamic, and there's often a great history narrative. And there's a sense, as you said, of kind of nostalgia for some often mythical, idealized version of the past. And it changes. And this is what is so interesting and I think useful about populism is that it can tactically pivot based on the needs of the day. And so the in-group can expand, the other can switch, right? I mean, if you think about how the AKP had kind of partnered with the Gulen movement, and then after that split, it has the peace process with the Kurds. And then in July of 2015, the Kurds become the villain and they switch to the MHP, right? So you can technically pivot, creating a new narrative and often picking from a different era of history, right? And so the project that you mentioned earlier, the filmmaking project, Filmmaking the Nation Great Again, my colleague Jonas Drega and I created a data set of over 11,000 YouTube videos that were distributed by different institutions and coded them based on which historical events appeared most, because we were really interested in kind of instrumentalizations of history. Manzikert shows up. Conquest of Istanbul shows up. Most frequently were the Independence War and Çanakkale. And this is really interesting because this appeals not only to those who are, fans of the Ottoman era, but also who would associate themselves with Ataturk as a great figure. Now, he would have been Gazi Mustafa Kemal back then, right? And wouldn't have been dressed in his Western, suit and tie. He would have worn a kalpak. He would have been an Ottoman soldier who was fighting the West, which serves the AKP's narrative very strategically then and now. So I think it is interesting that those battles are being referenced. What immediately strikes is that I think history often repeats itself. And if you look at the language that is being used, it's not dissimilar to that of the Nowruz speeches in 2013, right? So Öcalan's speech at Nowruz, the holiday, was read. Obviously, he's in jail, still in jail. But it says, we have always been brothers under the same flag of Islam. And I remember a lot of people being kind of skeptical about that at the time, but optimistic and encouraged. And perhaps this can be finally a solution to this conflict, right? But then look what happens in July of 2015 and how quickly those words that are used to create this narrative of unity can fall apart, and how quickly conflict can return and how brutally it can return. So I see it makes sense that Kurds are hopeful about change and wanting this to finally be the end of this conflict for which they sacrificed so much. But I think there's also a case that things can fall apart, particularly when, as was the case in 2015, Kurds were exhibiting political victories, right? Demirtas, the HDP, getting these unprecedented gains in June election 2015. So all of that is to say, identity can be useful. Identity politics and unity can be useful in symbolically bringing people together, but they don't necessarily solve the past tensions, conflicts, and they don't necessarily build a very strong foundational base that can withstand any kind of political turmoil.
Mm-mm. Yeah, and then right now, Spotify's considering leaving Turkey because people are making playlists with names that are offensive to politicians. At the same time, Wikipedia was banned for 2 or 3 years. Was it? Was it more? It was banned for too long, let's say.
YouTube was
And
banned. Um, so like 2008 to 2010, say. So they've definitely been banning these platforms as a strategy of controlling narratives. I think what's interesting is that they're not just policing media by banning it, but they're also producing it and making sure that they're getting their narrative out there as well.
yeah, and at the same time, putting in jail people like Zafer Party chair Ozda, who was very critical of the government, possibly because of this peace process initiative. And at the same time, you have the CHP crackdown where there's all these detentions of the opposition party members. So to move to your grand strategy book project, which you're doing with Burke, Essen, and Tudor Onea, where do you place the CHP crackdown in all of this? Because it looks like long-term trajectory, the AKP has made the cultural groundwork, the narrative groundwork through this media. It's shut down alternative voices to varying success, but generally you can say that there's not that much diversity in mainstream media. You can still find stuff online. At the same time, you have Erdogan framing the CHP over and over again as Kemalists, secular Kemalists that served foreign powers and divided Turks and Kurds. And now AKP is basically fixing what they did wrong. This is how he frames it, right? And currently, he's dividing the opposition. He's separating them from CHP so that he can have longevity. The AKP can have longevity, right? And the clearest example is the jailing of Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu, who would be his most formidable contender in future elections, right? So where do you place all these narratives and this revisionism of what it means to be Turk and secular, or the Kemal legacy, the Ataturk legacy? How do you understand it in the AKP's grand strategy? Small question.
Yeah, tiny question. And grand strategy is tiny anyway. Well, so grand strategy is, when we think about it as kind of a field of study within international relations literature, has to do with how states view themselves in the international system and kind of what their national interests are, or what threats to those interests are, how they can achieve those interests, and how they can protect. And I think what's really interesting that what we're seeing is the development of what Bark and Tudor and I are trying to theorize as a populist grand strategy. And we've had lots of great writing recently on populism and foreign policy, but nothing really looked at the overarching worldview of a state and the role that populism can play in that. And what we're doing, looking at that us versus framing, we look at the great history narratives. We look at Turkey as a righteous riser that is a rising power that's kind of like punching above its weight in the international system, acting like a great power without necessarily having the material capabilities that we would usually use to define a great power, but believing itself and portraying itself as righteous in deserving of that recognition, of that place at the table. So if you look at the kind of global media, and I want to talk quickly about Fatih and some of the changes that have been made within the communications networks and platforms within Turkey. But there's very much been a concerted effort to portray Turkey as initially like regional leader, then Muslim leader, then global South leader, then kind of world leader. And if you listen to the language that he used on Saturday, and it was kind of, lighting up the stage, it was very much about Erdogan as a world leader. The world has been waiting for us. Here's this global leader. And I think that the branding of their grand strategy has been very much in the how he so frequently refers to the world as bigger than five, that, the referring to the United Nations Security Council and the idea that the international order has been set by powers, leaving lots of other countries and populations underrepresented. So basically, we need to change the world order, and we need countries like Turkey to have much more. And so much of the global media branding has been about. Now, populism and these grand narratives, again, have this us versus them dimension. And this is where we tie it back into the CHP. And having recognized precisely as you said, that Imamoglu finally posed a threat to Erdogan, right? In terms of because you had the 2023 elections, you had a group of six parties that couldn't really get along. You had Kılıçdaroğlu, who wasn't the most charismatic candidate, had some other challenges to his candidacy and ability to be elected, all on an incredibly tilted playing field, let's be clear about. But I think with Imamoglu, it was clear that now there is a candidate. Now we need to do something about this. And so I don't think it's surprising that we saw the operation against him that we did. With Harun Ercan, I've written in the past about how the government has kind of been able to benefit from a permissive prejudice that allowed it to remove mayors in the Kurdish region without big backlash. But we said, after the consolidation of power in 2023, look for this maybe to happen to the CHP as well. And I think that's very much what is happening. And so you can see these grand narratives of rising Turkey, strong Turkey. If you look at the content of some of the videos, the role of like tech nationalism and drones and Turkey is this great power in Africa and all of these other places, that's about trying to build democracy, right? But another part of the three pillars of authoritarianism is repression, right? So you have legitimation, co-optation, and repression. And I think we're all three at play. So I very much see the CHP kind of accelerated repression, perhaps pushing lines that we wouldn't have seen them take in the past. I see that as kind of out of necessity of having realized that this is now a threat. We need to address that threat. We need to get the Kurds on board so we can make the constitutional changes that we want to. And we're going to drive a wedge as far as we can between any possibility for the CHP to form some kind of.
Yeah, sorry, cut out a few times towards the end there. You said the CHP drive a wedge where?
So the AKP is trying to drive a wedge between the Kurds and the CHP to ensure that they can't, and has been trying to for a while, and I think it is driving that even further, criminalizing the CHP in the way that they used to criminalize HDP, now DEM, and that is because they any possibility of those two coming together with, of course, a very charismatic candidate on top of it.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and I see that you're on the Turkish Wi-Fi that doesn't have a reputation for being so fast, but, thank you for
Well,
sticking with it. It's working generally. Hopefully, it's not too much of an annoyance to our audience, which, by the way, sent a question. Mohammed is asking if there's a difference in the narratives that AKP pro-AKP media is presenting towards Arab audiences. Have you noticed in your research, watching all the shows that you watch and all the stats that you collect, do you see anything different that's directed specifically towards Arab audiences?
so what's interesting is that the instrumental use of, say, these popular television shows started off as not a strategy, just something that there was a market. So the Turkish television industry is an incredibly competitive one. And that means that production value has to be very high. It means that they are making shows like a 2.5 hour show within a week. Uh, and it means that they're seeking other markets, seeking external markets as well. And so these shows had, perhaps being driven by political economy factors, but had a lot of cultural affinity that seemed to appeal to audiences that wanted, like, conservative but glamorous, and modern but family values, and beautiful Bosphorus views, but also modest, no kissing, sex scenes, things like that. So there's a lot of great research done by media scholars in Turkey on kind of the appeal of these. What was interesting that we didn't necessarily expect was that Arab audiences were going to like the Ottoman content, because if you think about it, that doesn't necessarily make sense, right? Like, this was an imperial power, but they've been able to kind of portray this again as Muslim heroes. And so I do think that was something that was appealing. What I will note, and I'm glad the question was asked, is that you can look at the way in which media is functioning as a political tool during times of crisis. So during the GCC crisis of 2017, 2018, when Turkey was supporting Qatar and there was a blockade against Qatar, Saudi Arabia pulled television content. Egypt had issued a fatwa against it. And a UAE production company produced a series called Kingdoms of Fire. And it was meant to, as the producer articulated, to counter Ottoman tyranny. So to kind of try to show the Arabs as the heroes and the Ottomans as villains in that case. It turns out it didn't go over very well with audiences. Like, they were using VPNs to find their Turkish TV show content because they really enjoyed that. But I think that's really interesting in terms of kind of contested narratives of who's the Sunni leader in the region and how does media play into that. So I guess I would also note that in terms of reaching out to Arab audiences, there were a lot of direct marketing efforts by bringing stars with them on trips, right? Trips to Kuwait, trips to Qatar. They would bring a television celebrity with them. I believe there was one scheduled for Egypt as well, and then the Arab uprisings happened. So there's almost been like a celebrity diplomacy that the government has been used to try to cultivate those audiences.
Yeah, and I'm not an expert, obviously, but in Saudi Arabia is trying to finance some series, right? And they haven't been as successful as Turkish ones. Is that correct?
Not
Is Turkey like is Turkey
Yeah.
leading the pack basically for this kind of series that are that have good positive images of regional cultures, basically?
It's a really good question. Yeah, no, Saudi has not been as successful. I've talked to some Saudi producers, but I think what they've been doing is they've been bringing in Turkish content teams or cultural production teams. No, this is not uncommon at all. Used to be Egypt and Syria were kind of the leaders of television production. Then you had Turkey, you had obviously Lebanon had its own industry as well. So what Saudi, I think, has done is used that vacuum that happened when you took out all the Turkish content, because there was a lot of it, and they tried to cultivate their own domestic industry, in part by bringing in consultants. So I think Peter Weber was director of the Kingdoms of Fire series that I mentioned, but also bringing in Lebanese content producers as well. So I think that to get to Turkey's level of number 2 or number 3 exporter, you have a long way to go. But I think Saudi definitely tried to seize the opportunity.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. And if there's any other questions, ask them now or forever hold your peace with Lisel at least. Uh, I'm going to ask what comes next based on what you're seeing. You spend a lot of time thinking about media, identity politics, political narratives. There's a very new brew in Turkey. There's a new trend lines. I feel like this kind of environment hasn't existed. I've been here 10 years. This feels like something different than what we faced before. What's the next step? Where's Turkey headed? Because some people are giving me some very negative forecasts.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, Turkey is not headed in any domestic politics speaking. I don't see that, even with the peace process with the Kurds. I don't see this as a move towards democracy at all. I see this as a move towards the AKP trying to use all the opportunity structures it can to instill itself and its leader further. So I worry very much about that. I think Turkey will continue to be successful on the international stage in the way that Erdoğan is marketing it as this, vanguard of the global South, as this indispensable mediator. We've seen efforts to mediate in Palestine and Israel. We've seen obviously successful efforts in Ukraine and Russia, in Sudan, more successfully in Somalia, Ethiopia. So it's always, I don't want to say always, I think there have been very canny tactics to use to position Turkey as the ideal mediator or negotiator, to kind of get a seat at that table, have the world recognize that Turkey should play a larger role. I mean, I think, I think that Fahrettin Altun's, so he was up until a couple of days ago the head of the Directorate of Communications. He was very much branding Turkey's global communication strategy. He was head of the directorate since it was founded in 2018. And I think it'll be interesting to see the direction that marketing campaign go. You have maybe not so much of like an ideological shift with Burhanettin Duran coming in. Both of those individuals, they were in SETA together, the pro-government think tank that has international branches. I mean, it may be even more of an international focus, like more of an international relations background, given Duran's background. I also note that the board of directors of TRT changed 2 days ago, and Hilal Kaplan is out. The general director remains, but the head of the board of directors has changed. A sort of culture and arts person is out, and a economist is in. So that's quite interesting, I think, to watch. So in terms of media strategy, I think this is a really interesting inflection point. But in terms of where Turkey is going overall, I expect more authoritarian consolidation at home and more attempts to portray Turkey as a global power abroad.
Yeah, and that's without knowing what happens in Iran, Gaza, or Ukraine. So let's see what the external impacts are. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of changes going on, and I appreciate you coming on to talk about it. Um, People that joined us, I'm going to ask them a question. Please write to info@turkeyrecap.com if you have a suggestion. Lisel and I would like to do an event, an in-person event. If you like this and you want to do some kind of get together that involves media and politics in Istanbul, with drinks or without, whatever you prefer, please send us any ideas you might have on venues. We're looking for a venue that might host an in-person event because we want to have some fun this summer while we still can before there's other issues that take over the narrative. Because honestly, I just feel like I'm working between crises. There's been so much going on this year, just trying to keep up the pace, stay on the treadmill as a journalist. And yeah, we shouldn't forget to get together sometimes and meet the people that share our interests. So please write to info@turkeyrecap.com if you have suggestions on a venue in Istanbul for a fun event. We have
Yeah.
one last question. Should we look at it?
Go for it.
No, it's not a question.
Oh.
Slight correction, but it's okay. That's it. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And again, can't thank you enough for your support, Turkey Recap. And I hope to see you soon at an in-person event. If the audience missed the beginning of this show, you can find it in an hour or two on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or just go to turkeyrecap.com. That's it from me. Stay well, stay safe.
Thanks so much for having me.
See you.
See you.